Venezuela is sitting on the largest proven oil reserves on the face of the earth. I mean, by all traditional logic, it should be just a beacon of immense generational wealth.
Right.
It has the literal fuel that powers the modern global economy, bubbling right beneath its citizens' feet. Yet, it is tragically impoverished. And then, look at Switzerland.
Yeah, completely different story.
It is entirely landlocked.
Yeah.
It has zero access to ocean shipping routes, incredibly difficult mountainous terrain, and like almost no natural resources to speak of, yet it is consistently one of the wealthiest, most prosperous nations on the planet.
It completely defies the basic intuition we all carry about how the world works.
Hmm.
We tend to view global economics through a very physical lens.
Tangible resources, right?
Exactly. Tangible resources should equal tangible wealth.
Hmm.
But when you look at the actual macroeconomic data, that equation falls apart entirely.
Today, we are opening a massive stack of research. Papers, historical records spanning 4 centuries, and the official data from the 2024 Nobel Prize Committee.
It's a lot to get through.
It is, but we're doing it to answer what is arguably the ultimate economic mystery of our time. And the mission of this deep dive is to unpack the definitive answer to a single, just paralyzing question for you listening. Why are the top 20% of countries in the world 30 times richer than the poorest 20%?
30 times. And that number's hard to even conceptualize.
Right, 30 times. And here is the truly staggering part. Even though the world as a whole is growing wealthier every day thanks to technology, this 30-to-1 ratio is completely stagnant. The poorest nations are simply not catching up.
Yeah, and when you hear a statistic like 30 times richer, the sheer scale of the math can really obscure the human reality.
Absolutely.
We aren't just talking about GDP numbers moving on a Bloomberg terminal. That ratio represents vast disparities in life expectancy, infant mortality, the strength of a currency, and the fundamental ability of an individual to plan for their future without fear of, arbitrary confiscation.
Yeah, the basic safety net of life.
Exactly. The fact that this gap is locked in place, refusing to budge despite decades of hyperglobalization and foreign aid, is the great puzzle.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we even get into the groundbreaking theory that solves this puzzle, we have to talk about the origin of the prize itself.
Oh, the history of the prize is fascinating.
The Nobel Prize in Economics has this incredibly ironic, almost funny history that I think sets the stage perfectly for the kind of rigorous proof we're about to look at.
It is definitely one of the great quirks of academia. Alfred Nobel, the man who established the foundation, was a chemist and an engineer.
Right.
But his massive fortune came from inventing dynamite. He was, for all intents and purposes, a bomb maker.
Oh, bomb maker. Yeah.
And the legend goes that when his brother died, a French newspaper accidentally published Alfred's obituary instead. And as under the headline, "The Merchant of Death is dead."
I mean, I can't even imagine reading my own obituary, let alone one that brands me a literal supervillain.
Mm-hmm.
He panicked. He wanted to sanitize his legacy, so he left his vast fortune to fund prizes for physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace.
But no economics.
Right. If you look closely at that original 1895 will, economics is nowhere to be found.
Economics wasn't invited to the original party. It's technically not even a Nobel Prize.
Nope.
It's officially the Sveriges Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel. It was added in the late 1960s, and it's funded entirely by the Swedish Central Bank.
Yeah, there has always been this running joke in the academic community that economists desperately wanted a seat at the big table with the real scientists.
The physicists splitting the atom, right?
Exactly. The chemists synthesizing new compounds. And the joke is the only way they could get their foot in the door at the Nobel banquet in Stockholm was to convince a sovereign central bank to just foot the bill for their own award.
They just bought their way into the Smart Kids Club.
They really did.
But I think that joke masks a really important truth. As much as art scientists might tease the social sciences, economics, when it is built on rigorous, undeniable empirical data, has the capacity to massively improve the lives of billions.
Absolutely.
Discovering the true mechanics of wealth and poverty can literally pull nations back from the brink of collapse.
And there is no better example of that life-saving potential than the 3 titans of economics who took home the prize in 2024. Darren Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James A. Robinson.
Legends in the field.
Truly. These 3 are not just isolated academics running theoretical models. Their work is actively reshaping how major multinational institutions approach global development.
For you listening, just to give a sense of the sheer academic weight we are dealing with here, Daron Acemoglu is currently the third most referenced economist in the entire world.
Yeah, that's a wild statistic.
His work is cited more often than household names like Paul Krugman, Milton Friedman, or even John Maynard Keynes. Many of you might know Acemoglu and Robinson from their massive bestseller, Why Nations Fail.
Which is a fantastic book that distilled a lot of this prize-winning work.
Exactly. But today, we are going to push past the summary and look at the deep causal mechanics they uncovered. We're going to dismantle the old assumptions about geography, examine the 400-year-old ghosts of colonialism that built the invisible rules governing our lives, and look at the brutal game theory of why struggling nations can't just fix themselves.
I think the best place to start dismantling those old assumptions is to return to the geographic paradox you mentioned at the very beginning.
The Venezuela and Switzerland thing.
Right. Because if we are going to understand their overarching theory, we first have to unlearn the geographic determinism that most of us are taught in grade school.
Yeah, the idea that the map dictates destiny. If you stop an average, well-informed person and ask why one country is rich and another is poor, they almost always point to physical traits.
Every single time.
They'll say it's about having temperate climates for farming, or possessing massive mineral wealth, or having a highly indented coastline that provides natural deepwater ports for global shipping.
And historically, prominent thinkers believed exactly that. Going all the way back to the philosopher Montesquieu in the 18th century, there was a widespread belief that climate and geography determined the work ethic and economic trajectory of a population.
It makes intuitive sense, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you play a simulation game like Civilization or SimCity, you put your settlement next to the river and the gold mine, and you win.
You win the game, but the real world macroeconomic data completely torches that theory.
Yeah, let's dig into the mechanics of that, because I'm trying to wrap my head around how a country can have trillions of dollars of liquid capital beneath its soil and still fail to feed its citizens.
It's the ultimate paradox.
Doesn't the sheer influx of foreign currency from oil exports automatically elevate a nation's baseline wealth?
You are hitting on a concept economists often call the resource curse. But Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson viewed it through a slightly different lens.
How so?
Well, the influx of foreign capital from selling oil doesn't automatically build a functional economy. It only enriches the specific entities that control the spigot. Let's contrast Venezuela with Ireland.
Okay.
Ireland has virtually no natural resources. No oil, no massive mineral deposits, mostly rocky soil. Yet, Ireland boasts a GDP per capita that is roughly 25 times greater than Venezuela's.
25 times. Wow.
So the physical resources are almost statistically irrelevant to the final outcome of the average citizen's wealth.
Completely irrelevant. And we see the same illusion with the concept of being landlocked, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The old geographic rule is that without a coastline, transport costs are too high to participate in the global market, dooming the country to poverty.
Right, because you can't ship your goods.
But look at Luxembourg or Liechtenstein. They are completely landlocked, yet they are financial powerhouses with some of the highest living standards in human history.
I was thinking about this geographic paradox, and the best analogy I could come up with is comparing a nation's economy to a computer.
Okay, I like this.
Think of the natural resources, the oil, the arable land, the deep water ports as the computer's hardware. Having an incredibly powerful, top-of-the-line motherboard and processor is a great advantage.
Sure.
But if that computer is running a completely corrupted, virus-riddled operating system, the hardware is useless. A basic laptop running a clean, hyper-efficient operating system is going to outperform the corrupted supercomputer every single time.
That is a phenomenal way to frame it. The operating system is exactly what Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson spent their careers analyzing.
The software of a country.
Exactly. And their core, Nobel-winning revelation is that the separating factor, the software that decides whether a nation becomes wealthy or remains impoverished, is almost universally the stability, fairness, and reliability of its institutions.
Institutions. It is a word that gets thrown around a lot in political science, and it honestly sounds a bit dry.
It does. It sounds very academic.
I think most people hear institutions and they picture a massive, imposing marble building with Roman columns in Washington, D.C. or London.
What's fascinating here is that we need to broaden that definition significantly.
Okay, how broad?
To understand institutions, we have to strip away the complex veneer of the global market and look at what an economy actually is at its most granular level.
Right.
An economy is simply a system for allocating resources between participants. That is all it is. It's people exchanging their time, their specialized skills, and their capital.
And if you want an economy to grow, you need to convince those participants to actually take risks and create value, rather than just hoarding what they have or stealing from their neighbor.
Exactly. And the only way to reliably incentivize human beings to create value is to guarantee them that they will be rewarded for their efforts.
They need a payoff.
If you do the work, you need absolute certainty that you will reap the payoff. An institution is simply the mechanism that provides that guarantee.
So it's not just the central bank or the Supreme Court.
Not at all. The scale is vast and invisible. Yes, it includes the top-level entities, but it also includes the local planning officers, municipal courts, a free press that exposes fraud, the specific wording of bankruptcy laws, and, the cultural expectation that a contract signed on paper actually means something.
Yeah, the unwritten rules, too.
Institutions are the visible and invisible rules of the game. They establish the incentive structure of a society.
Let's elevate this from theory to a real-world macroeconomic example, because I think it clarifies exactly how these rules dictate wealth.
Let's do it.
Let's say you are a venture capitalist, you have a massive pool of capital, let's say $50 million, and you want to invest it in a highly complex engineering startup developing a new microchip.
That's a massive concentration of risk and capital.
Huge. Why on earth would you hand over $50 million to a group of engineers you barely know? You only do it because you are operating within a web of inclusive institutions that guarantee a cascading economic multiplier.
Let's trace that institutional web. First, you rely on the institution of intellectual property.
Right.
You trust the patent office will grant this startup exclusive rights to their microchip design, meaning a larger competitor can't just steal the blueprints the next day.
Then you rely on corporate law. You trust that the term sheet you signed outlining your equity stake is legally binding.
You trust that the nation's centralized banking institution is actively managing inflation risk, so that if the startup goes public in 5 years, the returns you generate haven't been inflated away into worthlessness.
And if the founders try to defraud you, you trust that there is an impartial judiciary, a court system that doesn't care who the founders are related to, that will enforce your contract and recover your capital.
That entire sequence of events, from the initial pitch meeting to the massive wealth generation of a successful IPO, is entirely paved by institutions.
Paved by the rules of the game.
Now take that exact same venture capitalist with the exact same $50 million and place them in an economy lacking those systems.
It changes the math completely. If I know the patent office is corrupt and will just sell the microchip design to a state-owned enterprise.
Yeah.
Or if I know the courts are controlled by a local oligarch who will invalidate my equity if the company becomes profitable, I am not going to invest a single dime.
You will either hoard your capital, move it offshore, or you will invest it in political bribery to ensure you become the oligarch yourself.
Right, you play the different game.
The talent and energy of the entire population are diverted away from innovation and specialized production, and instead channeled toward extracting favors and defending against theft.
I'm really glad you brought up the word specialized, because earlier we talked about how institutions guarantee a payoff, but I want to push on that.
Yeah.
Why is specialization the holy grail here?
It's everything.
Why does a society of hyper-specialized people inherently become 30 times richer than a society of generalists?
Specialization is the engine of productivity. Think about a modern economy. We have people who spend 12 years of their lives doing nothing but studying the intricate neurosurgery of the human spine. We have people who spend decades understanding the specific aerodynamics of a turbine blade. But you can only dedicate your entire life to a hyper-niche pursuit if you trust that the rest of society will provide you with food, housing, electricity, and security.
Ah, I see. If there is no trust, if the supply chains are broken or your property could be seized at any moment, you can't afford to be a neurosurgeon.
No, you can't.
You have to be a farmer, a security guard, and a carpenter all at once just to
Well,
survive.
Precisely. In an environment with weak or extractive institutions, the risk of specialization is simply too high. People default to subsistence generalism.
Wow.
Good institutions lower the risk of reliance on others, allowing an entire population to safely invest massive amounts of their personal resources into becoming highly specialized. And when an entire society specializes, innovation explodes, efficiency skyrockets, and the aggregate wealth of the nation compounds.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because everything we just discussed makes logical sense. Rich countries have incredible courts, patent offices, and stable banks. Poor countries don't. But we're talking about a Nobel Prize in economics here. And in rigorous science, correlation does not equal causation.
This was the colossal scientific hurdle that Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson had to overcome. It is the endogeneity problem in econometrics.
The classic chicken or the egg dilemma.
Yes.
I want to play devil's advocate here because if I'm a skeptic looking at this data, I'm thinking we might have the causal arrow entirely backwards.
Okay, how so?
What if wealthy countries just have amazing impartial institutions simply because they are the only ones who can afford them? Like, an impartial Supreme Court and a highly functioning patent office aren't the cause of wealth. They are just a luxury good that a country buys once it's already rich from having good geography or finding oil.
It's an incredibly potent critique. It's often called the luxury good hypothesis of institutions. And the laureates had to completely dismantle it.
Because it makes intuitive sense.
It does. Because maintaining institutional integrity on a national scale is astronomically expensive.
Yeah.
Let's look at the sheer cost of running an impartial system.
Right, because an impartial judge doesn't work for free.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To eliminate corruption, you have to pay your civil servants, from the Border Customs agent to the federal appellate judge, a salary high enough to completely remove the financial temptation of bribery.
That makes sense.
If a tax auditor cannot afford to pay rent and feed their family on their state salary, they are mathematically incentivized to accept a bribe from a corporation to look the other way.
Yeah.
You quite literally get what you pay for in governance.
Furthermore, you need massive, constantly funded educational infrastructure just to produce the people capable of running these complex systems.
Like you do.
You need universities churning out actuaries, corporate lawyers, and monetary policy experts.
And then you factor in the mechanics of human capital migration, commonly known as the brain drain. In a highly globalized economy, highly skilled individuals are incredibly mobile.
Right, they can go anywhere.
If a developing nation manages, against all odds, to educate a brilliant central banker or a world-class patent lawyer, that individual has a choice. They can stay in a struggling system, or they can take their specialized skills to London, New York, or Singapore, where they will be compensated at a massive premium in a stable currency.
So the wealthy nations act like a magnet, constantly stripping the developing nations of the exact human capital they need to build their own institutions. It's a brutal cycle.
It is. So to earn the Nobel Prize, Acemoglu and his colleagues couldn't just write a paper saying, look, rich countries have nice laws.
Right, that wouldn't cut it.
They had to isolate the variables. They had to definitively, mathematically prove that the institutional rules preceded and caused the wealth, independent of any pre-existing economic advantage.
But how do you actually prove that? If this were chemistry, you'd take two identical countries, put them in a lab, give one a constitution with strong property rights and the other a corrupt autocracy, and wait 50 years.
Yeah, that would be ideal.
But you can't run a randomized control trial on the global economy.
You can't. So they had to become forensic historians. They needed to find a natural experiment, a moment in history where different institutional rules were randomly assigned to different parts of the world, and then track the macroeconomic fallout.
And they found their answer by looking back 400 years at the deep, permanent scars of European colonialism.
We are getting into a time machine here, and this is where their research completely shattered the prevailing academic consensus.
Okay, lay it on us.
When they looked at the economic data of various regions prior to the year 1500, before the major European empires began their global expansion, and then compared it to the wealth of those exact same regions today, they found something mind-bending.
What was it?
They discovered a phenomenon that coined the reversal of fortune, a complete historical inversion. The regions of the world that were the absolute richest, most highly developed, and most densely populated prior to colonialism became the poorest nations after.
But wait, really?
Yes. And conversely, the regions that were relatively desolate, poor, and underdeveloped prior to European arrival are now among the wealthiest nations on Earth.
I really need to pause and make sure I'm following this because it feels entirely counterintuitive. Are you telling me that having existing wealth, infrastructure, and a massive population was actually a disadvantage in the long run?
It was a catastrophic disadvantage.
Yeah.
And the mechanism behind it is terrifyingly rational from the perspective of the colonizers. Let's look at how the laureates measured this.
Okay.
Before the invention of GDP tracking, economists measured historical wealth primarily through urbanization rates and population density. A region could only support a dense urban population if it had highly productive agriculture and an advanced division of labor.
So places like the Aztec Empire in modern-day Mexico, or the Inca Empire in Peru, or the incredibly dense, wealthy regions of the Indian subcontinent.
Exactly. These areas were thriving. Now, put yourself in the shoes of the Spanish conquistadors or the British East India Company. Your goal is not to build a flourishing egalitarian society. Your goal is to extract maximum wealth to send back to the crown or your shareholders.
Right, it's a smash and grab.
When you arrive in a region that is already densely populated and wealthy, you find something highly lucrative, a ready-made labor force.
You don't need to incentivize anyone to build a society from scratch. You just need to conquer the existing society and enslave the population.
This is the critical moment. In these wealthy, dense regions, the colonizers deliberately engineered what the laureates call extractive institutions.
Extractive institution. Okay.
The most famous example is the Spanish encomienda system, or the mita system in Peru. The entire legal framework was designed to strip all property rights from the indigenous population, force them into brutal labor in silver mines or plantations, and extract the resources. The political power was concentrated into the hands of a tiny, elite colonial class.
They intentionally built an operating system designed for theft and control. There were no patent offices for the locals. There were no impartial courts. If an indigenous person specialized in a craft and created wealth, it was immediately confiscated by the colonial elite.
And here is the lingering macroeconomic tragedy. Eventually, the colonial empires collapsed, or they were forced out through violent independence movements. But when the European administrators retreated, they left behind a massive power vacuum.
But the machinery they built, the extractive legal codes, the concentrated power structures, the monopolies remained intact.
The machinery survived, and in almost every case, new local political factions, military juntas, or regional elites simply stepped right into that power vacuum and took over the existing extractive institutions.
Wow, they didn't dismantle it.
Why dismantle a machine that grants you absolute power and wealth? Instead of rewriting the operating system to be inclusive, they just put themselves at the controls. Because these systems were fundamentally engineered for exploitation rather than productive economic growth, they naturally bred the extreme corruption and instability that continues to cripple these regions today.
So the wealth of the past literally cursed their future because it incentivized the creation of terrible rules. Now, let's look at the other side of this natural experiment. What happened when the European empires arrived in regions that were less prosperous, sparsely populated, and lacked that ready-made labor force? I'm thinking of places that would eventually become the modern-day United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand.
When the British arrived in North America, for instance, they found a very different landscape. It lacked the massive, dense urban centers of the Aztec Empire, and it didn't possess the immediate surface-level mineral wealth like the Silver Mountains of Potosi.
And crucially, the indigenous populations in these areas, while present, were not densely concentrated in a way that the colonizers could easily enslave en masse to work large plantations, at least not initially in places like the northern colonies.
Right. To make these specific colonies profitable, the empires faced a massive logistical problem. They had to actually build an economy from scratch, which meant they had to attract European settlers to cross a dangerous ocean and do the work themselves.
And we must be incredibly clear here to add the necessary moral and historical context that the laureates acknowledge.
Yeah.
While they sought European settlers to build these systems, the heavy labor of building out these colonies, particularly in the agricultural South, was heavily and tragically supported by the importation of slave labor, as well as convict labor in places like Australia.
It is a vital context. The systems they built were inclusive, but only for a highly specific, defined group of European settlers, completely excluding, devastating, and displacing the indigenous populations and enslaved peoples. However, from a purely macroeconomic structural standpoint regarding how the legal framework operated for the accepted citizens, the colonizers had to offer those settlers an immense incentive to risk their lives.
Because if I'm a British citizen in 1615, I'm not getting on a boat to Jamestown to face starvation and disease unless you offer me something I can't get in London.
And what they offered was rights. Early attempts by the Virginia Company to use extractive martial law to force settlers to work failed miserably. The settlers just starved or ran away into the frontier.
They opted out.
To save the colony, the administrators realized they had to establish inclusive institutions. They created the General Assembly to grant political representation. They guaranteed private property rights. They established legal frameworks where a settler could farm a plot of land and keep the profits of their labor.
They wrote a totally different code. They built an operating system that rewarded individual investment and specialization.
Yes. And when these settler colonies eventually claimed their independence from Europe, the dynamic was entirely different from the extraction colonies.
How so?
The settlers didn't pack up and leave. They stayed. This was their home. And crucially, they maintained the institutional memory of how to run these protective frameworks. Over the centuries, those initial property rights and representative assemblies naturally evolved, expanded, eventually becoming truly inclusive over long, painful civil rights struggles, and fostered the massive modern economic growth we see in those nations today.
It's an overwhelming theory, but it perfectly explains the reversal of fortune. The initial conditions dictated the rules, and the rules dictated the next 400 years of wealth.
Exactly.
But if I'm pushing back again, 400 years of global history is incredibly noisy. There are a million different variables, wars, plagues, technological shifts. Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson needed something sharper to prove this wasn't just a grand historical narrative. They needed a control group.
And they found the ultimate control group in what the Nobel Committee highlighted as the tale of two cities. We are talking about the reality of Nogales.
So what does this all mean? I want you listening to really picture this in your mind. It is a single metropolitan area, physically divided east to west by a literal border fence.
On the northern side of that fence, you have Nogales, Arizona, in the United States. If you look at the economic and social data here, residents enjoy high average incomes by global standards.
Yeah.
They have long life expectancies, broad access to public education, comprehensive healthcare infrastructure, a stable currency, and highly reliable property rights. They have access to commercial credit to start a business.
And they operate under a representative government, from electing a local city council all the way up to voting for the president of the United States.
Now look, just a few feet away, across the fence to the southern side, Nogales in Sonora, Mexico.
Night and day.
The contrast is stark. The area is considerably poorer. Average household income is a fraction of what it is in the north. Public health outcomes are significantly lower, and the business environment is severely hampered by systemic corruption, lack of credit access, and the looming threat of organized crime.
And this is where the geographic argument goes to die, because this is the exact same geographic location.
That is the empirical beauty of a regression discontinuity design. Both sides of that fence share the exact same physical geography. The climate is identical. The soil is identical. The disease environment is the same.
Right.
Furthermore, the populations share the exact same cultural heritage, the same historical roots, and often the exact same family lineages. The physical and cultural environments are perfect constants.
The single differing variable, the only thing that changes when you step across that line in the sand, is the institutions governing the people?
It is the definitive proof of their theory.
Ah.
And it connects directly to the colonial history we just outlined. The border wasn't always there. It was drawn relatively recently in historical terms.
Yeah.
But Sonora, Mexico, inherited the institutional legacy of the Spanish colonization of the dense Aztec and Mayan regions. Institutions heavily skewed toward extraction, top-down control, and high barriers to market entry. Even after the Mexican Revolution, the political monopolies largely persisted.
Meanwhile, Arizona inherited the settler colonial institutions of the United States. They inherited the Homestead Act, English common law, and decentralized banking. The fence in Nogales isn't just dividing two nations, it is literally dividing two different operating systems installed centuries ago.
It perfectly isolates the institutional effect. It proves that the rules matter more than the soil.
I want to pivot for a second, because it's easy for us to sit here and talk about institutions at the level of GDP, centuries of history, and national border policies. But how do these invisible rules actually impact the micro level of an individual human life?
That's a great question.
The source material provided a deeply personal, fascinating case study regarding this, focusing on something as simple as family records.
Yes, the story of a man named Charlie who used a genealogy platform called MyHeritage to trace his family tree. It acts as a profound micro-level lens on what we've been discussing.
The key detail in this case study is that Charlie's grandfather on his mother's side was a Holocaust survivor.
Which means his grandfather's early life was subjected to the ultimate manifestation of an extractive, destructive regime. When a state embraces totalitarianism, it doesn't just extract wealth. It extracts humanity.
Exactly. Under the Nazi regime, fundamental human rights were obliterated. And as a byproduct of that deliberate destruction, basic administrative records, birth certificates, property deeds, local census data were either lost, intentionally destroyed or rendered meaningless.
Yeah.
When a regime stops viewing a segment of its population as citizens and starts viewing them as disposable resources, the institutions that protect and validate their identity completely vanish.
It's the erasure of institutional memory. But the story has a remarkable twist. Because of the surviving, persistent power of positive, inclusive institutions in other regions of the world where his family eventually migrated or interacted, Charlie was still able to map his family history all the way back to the late 1800s.
And the specific physical artifacts he uncovered are what make this so relevant to our deep dive.
Yeah.
He found a local newspaper clipping detailing his great-grandparents' wedding in 1895.
Wow.
He found official government records of his grandfather's engineering patents. He found 1953 marriage records filed in a municipal registry in Westminster in the UK, alongside a restorable wedding photograph.
If we connect this to the bigger macroeconomic picture we've been painting, those specific artifacts, a local newspaper, a functioning patent office, a municipal marriage registry in Westminster, these are the tangible manifestations of the institutions Acemoglu and his colleagues are talking about.
That is such a profound realization. We spend so much time talking about how institutions protect capital, how they enforce venture capital term sheets, and how they secure property rights. But they do so much more than protect money.
A functioning patent office protects human innovation. It ensures that if a mind produces genius, that genius is permanently recorded, attributed, and rewarded. A local marriage registry and a free press protect your literal existence and your family lineage.
Good institutions protect human history across generations. They preserve the individual's place in the fabric of the world. When a society is functioning correctly under an inclusive operating system, it leaves a permanent paper trail of respect for its citizens.
It is the ultimate proof that fairness is not just an economic multiplier. It is the foundation of human dignity.
So if we pull all of this together, we have overwhelming, irrefutable evidence. We have the macro-level history of the 400-year reversal of fortune. We have the micro-level control group of the Nogales border. And we have the deeply personal evidence of human records surviving destruction. The Nobel laureates have mathematically proven that fair, inclusive institutions are the sole engine of lasting national wealth.
The empirical science is settled.
Which naturally leads to the ultimate, incredibly pragmatic question. If this is all true, and Oskamboo, Johnson, and Robinson have proven it beyond a shadow of a doubt, why doesn't every struggling nation just flip the switch?
Oh, the million-dollar question.
Right. Why doesn't the ruling regime of an impoverished country just read the Nobel paper, realize they are doing it wrong, and adopt the Swiss or American institutional model tomorrow morning?
You are stepping into the most difficult area of political economy. It is a phenomenon that economists refer to as the vicious stalemate. And it comes down to the brutal mathematical reality of game theory and human incentives.
Game theory. Okay.
Unfairly run, extractive institutions are terrible for the country as a whole, but they directly, massively benefit the elites who currently control the levers of power.
Right. If you are sitting at the top of a corrupt oligarchic system, that system isn't broken. It's working perfectly for you.
Precisely. Now, there are practical hurdles, of course. Transitioning to good institutions requires immense technical skill. You can't just decree an impartial judiciary. You have to train thousands of judges, auditors, and regulators.
Sure.
But the far more significant, almost insurmountable hurdle is the commitment problem. Building inclusive institutions inherently requires the ruling class to voluntarily surrender their monopoly on power.
But I'm still caught on a paradox here. Theoretically, if you look at the total aggregate wealth generated by inclusive systems, the pie gets massively bigger.
Right.
Isn't it far better and frankly far more financially lucrative to be the democratically elected leader of a booming $3 trillion economy than to be the despot of a failing, impoverished state where the currency is hyperinflating?
It is entirely rational to think that. A rising tide lifts all boats, including the leader's yacht. But the paradox is rooted in extreme risk. The ruling elite cannot guarantee they have no credible commitment that they will actually keep their wealth or their freedom if they introduce fair, egalitarian systems.
Because the moment you introduce a truly fair, independent court system, the very first thing that new court might do is prosecute you for the decades of corruption you used to enrich yourself.
Exactly. If you allow free, unrigged elections, the people might immediately vote you out of office and seize your assets. Because the new democratic institutions cannot credibly promise to grant the autocrat immunity, the autocrat's mathematically safest move is to reject reform and maintain violent extractive control.
It's a terrifying standoff. The elites know the country could be vastly richer, but they are paralyzed by the downside risk of losing everything. And the citizens can't trust the elites to enact partial reforms without assuming it's just a trap to identify dissidents. Neither side can make the first move. They are locked in a vicious stalemate where the entire nation is objectively worse off, but the immediate individual incentives strictly prevent change.
This raises an important question, and it was the final critical piece of the laureates' research. How does a nation actually escape this trap? If the game theory is so heavily stacked against reform, how have any countries ever transitioned from extractive to inclusive?
Did they find a common denominator in the historical data?
They did. And their findings challenge a lot of romanticized historical narratives. They found that the most statistically effective method for an economy to successfully transition and build lasting inclusive institutions is through gradual, peaceful, nonviolent transfers of power.
Wait, peaceful. Not the glorious violent revolutions we constantly see depicted in movies or read about in history books.
No. Historically, violent revolutions tend to be incredibly destructive to whatever physical and administrative infrastructure does exist. But far more importantly, a violent uprising usually just assassinates the old elite and creates a massive power vacuum.
Right, the vacuum again.
And what happens when there's a vacuum? A new, highly militarized ruling class fills it. They take over the exact same extractive institutions, perhaps rebranding them under a different ideological banner, maybe calling it the People's Revolution. But the fundamental mechanisms of exploitation, lack of property rights, and suppressed opposition remain exactly the same.
Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. The actors change, but the script remains extractive.
Precisely. Gradual, nonviolent democratic reform forces the elite and the citizens to negotiate. It slowly builds the institutional trust required for inclusive frameworks to take root without triggering the elite's fear of total annihilation.
We really need to step back and summarize the monumental weight of what we've covered today, because before Esimoglu, Johnson, and Robinson spent decades meticulously compiling this empirical data, a lot of this was just abstract philosophical debate.
It really was. For a long time, there was a highly legitimate ongoing debate in global economics and political science about the benevolent dictatorship model.
Oh, yeah.
The idea was that perhaps a strong, centralized, authoritarian leader who doesn't have to worry about the messy, slow bureaucracy of a democracy could unilaterally push through infrastructure projects and grow an economy faster.
But their data ended that debate permanently.
They did. They proved, with hard mathematical data spanning centuries and continents, that democracy, with its checks, balances, and inclusive institutions, is economically optimal. Fairness is not just a moral luxury. It is the fundamental mathematical prerequisite for lasting national wealth and innovation.
It has been an incredible intellectual journey. We started with the ironic joke of the economics Nobel, a prize funded by a central bank to legitimize a social science. And yet, that very science has handed us the master key to decoding the global map.
We learned that physical geography is largely an illusion, that having infinite gold or oil in the ground means absolutely nothing if you do not have fairness and predictability in your courts above the ground.
You traveled back 400 years to see the ghosts of colonialism, realizing that the extractive or inclusive legal codes written centuries ago by foreign empires are the invisible architecture governing the wealth of modern nations today.
And we saw the undeniable localized proof at the fence in Nogales and in the family records of a Holocaust survivor. Wealth, prosperity, and human dignity are entirely dependent on the rules of the game.
So, tomorrow, when you are going about your day, maybe you're signing a lease or reading about a patent dispute in the news or watching a local city council meeting, I challenge you to look at those mundane things entirely differently. Don't look at them as boring bureaucracy. Look at them as the literal engines of your personal prosperity. They are the software that allows you to safely specialize, innovate, and thrive.
It is a profound shift in perspective. Once you see the institutions, you can never unsee them.
But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own, a thread that builds on everything we've unpacked today but looks forward instead of backward.
Well, let's hear it.
If the Nobel laureates have definitively proved that physical geography doesn't determine wealth, but national institutions do, well, what happens to the concept of wealth in our rapidly approaching future?
That is a fascinating pivot.
Think about the technological shift we are living through right now. We are entering an era of remote work, digital nomads, network states, and decentralized cryptocurrencies. For the first time in human history, individuals and capital have the ability to completely bypass the physical geographic borders of their local institutions.
You could physically live in a country with highly extractive rules, but operate economically entirely within a decentralized digital framework.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, are we about to witness the creation of entirely new borderless cloud institutions? And if so, looking back at the 400-year-old scars of the reversal of fortune we just talked about, will the massive tech empires and decentralized networks of tomorrow build these cloud institutions to be inclusive, empowering the individual creator? Or will they be engineered to be extractive, designed simply to harvest our data, our attention, and our labor for a new digital elite at the top?
History tells us that the initial architecture of an institution dictates the centuries of wealth or poverty that follow. The code they write now will be the borders of the future.
The software of tomorrow is being written right now. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the map, look closely at the invisible rules around you, and stay insanely curious.